So, right now, the world of geopolitics is a pretty chaotic place, even more chaotic than usual. In just the past few weeks, we've had negotiations between the US and Russia that are now taking place, but without Europe or even Ukraine in the room. We've had various claims from Donald Trump about all the things that he might or might not do when it comes to European security. And we've had a pretty brutal awakening for Europe as the transatlantic alliance that we've been relying on for decades now looks like it's falling apart, or at least it's a lot more shaky than we would like. And that's still just scratching the surface. I mean, just the past week, the United States voted against a United Nations resolution supporting Ukraine, together with Russia, China, and Iran that voted the same way, which already is a major unprecedented event that took place just a few days ago, but it already feels like old news. So, even for someone who follows geopolitics on a day to day basis and who knows quite a lot about it, it can easily feel extremely confusing and overwhelming. And it's hard to just make sense out of everything that's going on. And so, I wanted to help you, or anyone who might be interested, to do that by sharing how I personally think about all this and how I try to understand it and make sense of it, and how I decide what actually matters and what I think is important to watch out for, and what it can all this lead to in the near future. And to me, it kind of comes down to three major questions that are sort of in the background of all the noise that's coming out of the media and everything that's going on. And to me, these are the questions to keep an eye on, because the answers to them, which we will probably learn in the coming months, will hugely impact what happens next. And the questions I'm talking about, in my view, are these. First, how far is Donald Trump willing to actually go in concessions to Russia in the ongoing negotiations? And whether he's willing to give it everything just to get a quick end of the war or not. Second, does Russia actually want to stop fighting, even though it didn't really achieve its main goals? And is it ready to accept a deal, even though it might not satisfy all it originally set out to do? And third, is Europe finally ready to step up and start being an independent player in negotiations, its own security, and the wider geopolitics? In my view, those are the questions that matter, and I will try to answer why I think that. But I don't pretend like I have all the answers, because to be honest, I don't think that anyone has. We can't predict the future, and it would be unfair to try to pretend like it is possible. I think at this point, unfortunately, we just have to wait and see. But what I'm going to try to do instead is to highlight what the impact of the different answers might look like, what each pathway might lead to, even though we don't know at the moment which pathway the future will actually take. In other words, what I'm trying to do here is not about prediction of which of the many future possible scenarios will actually end up happening, but rather an analysis of what these scenarios would look like if they were to happen. So let's get into it. So the first question is how much Donald Trump is actually willing to give to Russia in the ongoing negotiations. And why that one matters is, I think, quite clear. At this point, the United States are negotiating on behalf of Ukraine and the wider Europe, and it doesn't seem like Trump and his negotiation team are taking the European or Ukrainian concerns very seriously. In other words, it seems that what they care about is what the US can get out of this, rather than what the implications for European security or for Ukraine are going to be. And what that means is that it's extremely important what Donald Trump, because no one else really matters, actually wants out of these negotiations. And if you actually listen to him in almost any interview and speech where he talked about this, he is quite consistently clear about his priority. He wants to end the war, and he wants to end it as soon as possible. It was a major campaign promise that he was making for the past year. And also, he wants to look like a president that ends wars. And he also wants to differentiate himself from Biden, whom he sees and presents as the president who allowed the war to start. And he wants to be seen as the president who brought it to an end instead. And maybe that sounds obvious, but the key distinction here is that he doesn't seem to care that much about how exactly the war will end. He doesn't care about a just or even long term sustainable peace. He just wants it to end. And I think that he's pretty honest about that. That's his number one priority. And if we take a step back, before Trump, there have sort of been two schools of thought on how that can be achieved. Either through strength, basically by increasing pressure to push Russia into a position where it has to stop the war because it has no other options and start real negotiations, or through concessions. So basically giving Russia something or everything in exchange for stopping the war. A policy that you could also call appeasement. In reality, it's not that binary, meaning that you don't just have two options of either only full pressure or only concessions, but it's more of a spectrum where on one hand you have the pressure, aka the stick, and on the other hand you have the carrot, so the options you can sort of offer in return. But you can also use both at the same time or find yourself wherever on the spectrum. And before Trump, or before his second turn, the mainstream view, both in the US and in Europe, was that it should be mainly the stick. That the way to do this is to increase the pressure, and that to think about concessions to Russia can lead to some pretty bad endings, and so we should just stay away from that completely. And to be honest, it was kind of a big unknown about which end Trump himself would lean to. And while it seemed like he might be more friendly towards Russia than Biden administration was, there was also quite a lot of hope in Europe and even in Ukraine that it might be the other way, and that he might be more resolute when dealing with Putin than Biden actually was. Maybe that was kind of a wishful thinking, but what is quite clear now that since Donald Trump's inauguration, he seems to be leaning into the carrot a lot more. Or rather, he's leaning into the carrot when dealing with Russia, and he seems to be using the stick when dealing with Ukraine. So basically the opposite of what most people hoped for, and the opposite of the strategy that was prevalent until now, which is the reason why those policies are causing so much shock in Europe. That's basically what has been happening up until now. But the real question that matters now, and the answer to which we still don't know, is how far he's willing to go in that. And what price is he willing to accept on Europe's and Ukraine's behalf to bring the war to an end? Because if Trump really only cares about the end of the war as soon as possible, then in theory, the fastest way for him to get there might be to just brute force Ukraine into giving Russia everything it wants. And let's leave aside now whether Ukraine would accept that or not. But if he really did only care about ending the war right now and didn't care at all about how this war is going to end or what happens in the future, from his very narrow perspective, that would be an okay deal. Now, for Europe and for Ukraine and for the long term stability of the world and peace, and also in the long term for the United States as well, that wouldn't be a good deal. I mean, history kind of shows that these policies rarely lead to positive outcomes, and in the long term, they likely wouldn't help the US either. But there is a real chance that Trump just doesn't care about any of that. And a deal that would hand Ukraine over to Russia sounds to him like it's not that bad. But, and this is really important, we just don't know that yet. What matters in negotiations is not what it seems like, especially not in the middle of it, but what the final agreement looks like. And Trump has a history of big claims that sometimes do come true, but often also they do not. I mean, at this point, Trump has said in the span of 24 hours that he might both continue supplies of military aid to Ukraine and get rid of sanctions on Russia. But whether either of those two things is actually going to happen is almost impossible to predict with any level of certainty. The tricky thing about Trump is that it's not that he never does what he says he will do, or that he always does what he says he will do, but that he constantly says a lot of things that are all over the place, and you just have no idea of knowing which of them are actually true and which of them are actually going to end up happening or not. So while I think that the risk of Trump handing Russia everything it wants, including Ukraine, does exist, and obviously it would be extremely bad, at this point we would be evaluating what each side is saying rather than what they are doing. At this point, we only have signals rather than actions. And so on that, we'll just have to see. And what really matters is what a potential deal, if there even is one, looks like, rather than what Trump is saying during the negotiations. So that's the question of what the US is going to do. And then you have the question of what Russia is going to do, which to me comes down to the question, which is, does Russia at this point actually want to stop fighting and find some kind of a deal, or does it want to keep fighting the war and just drag out any possible negotiations for as long as possible? This is the end of the free part, but you can find the full version on Patreon. As a patron, you'll also get full ad-free interviews with fantastic guests and the chance to ask them your own question, and exclusive Patreon-only analysis on geopolitics. And you'll also be joining a great community of people who care deeply about geopolitics, strategy, and defense, all while directly supporting my work. If that sounds good, you can join us on Patreon using the link in the description, and if not, I'll see you next time.